My name is Lindsay Olesberg. I think you already know René. René and I have been friends since 2013. So we met in a gathering of that's called the Lausanne Movement. So it's a network, an international network for Christian leaders. And then in 2016, we had the opportunity to work on Revelation together for a conference. I was doing the scripture engagement. He was doing the Bible exposition. And then since then, we've had other opportunities. Particularly in 2018, we went quite deep into Revelation. And so it's been a joy as we come to ELF this year that we've been able to continue in that.
Can I just share what the very deep is? Lindsay flew all the way to Rome, spent a few days with us, and then took us to showed some things in Rome, and we took a place called Domitian's Cafe. Remember that? At Piazza Navona, so like a hardcore revelation.
That's right. That's right. During this workshop, we'll be having some time to kind of take some of what René's already been sharing and kind of solidify it and bring it together. In synthesis, there'll also be some new things, but we're hoping that we can help us think about applying it to your context as well. So, as you've heard, the book of Revelation is a prophetic testimony to the churches of Asia Minor. It's concerning both the present and the future. So, very important that Revelation is always about the present, not just about the future. John's vision of Jesus Christ and of the enemies of God reframes the church's perspective of reality. It uses provocative images and symbols. John's letter exposes Satan's deception over the nations. And as we've heard, spiritual evil expresses itself in political, economic, and social dimensions. And this evil is overcome by Jesus, the slain lamb and the judge of all creation. At its heart, Revelation is asking the question, who will rule the nations? It's really the through line. Who will rule the nations? The Roman Empire claimed supremacy over the nations, but from the very beginning of the book, John declares that Jesus is the true ruler of the kings of the earth. Well, as you heard from René on our first morning together, the Revelation is a very specific genre. And it's strange, okay, very strange. Now, it's not just strange for us who are far from it. Even Eusebius, who was a church historian writing during the reign of Constantine and chronicled the history of Christianity up to AD 24, he wrote, "Some of our predecessors rejected the book altogether, criticizing it as unintelligible and illogical. They say it's not a revelation in any sense, since it is veiled by its thinking rather than through a thick curtain of incomprehensibility. Though I do not understand it, I suspect that the words have a deeper meaning." So, and perhaps through church history, there's been a temptation to either like kind of overly focus on it and map reality off of it, or just back off from it. I think something that really helps, though, is when we come to understand what the nature of the apocalyptic genre is. The word, of course, does mean uncovering or revealing. And it was a genre used during times of extreme suffering to strengthen the resolve and faithfulness of God's people in the face of external pressures, such as in Ezekiel, in Daniel, in Zechariah. It is a type of prophetic literature, okay? So it's a subset of prophetic literature, and the rules of interpreting prophetic literature would apply. But it's a particular type, and so there's some additional rules that go with that. But you just have to remember the audience is always people that are under crushing pressure, and they're asking, where is God? Here's some of the common features of apocalyptic literature. One is providing a heavenly perspective on earthly events. So the topic is about earthly events, but getting a new perspective on that, God's perspective. The second is the using of symbols and imagery. And therefore, it's very important that the symbols and imagery in Revelation, as well as in other apocalyptic literature, are not taken in their literal sense, but artistically and poetically. and we'll be unpacking this quite a bit more. It's important to recognize always that symbols do not have meaning in a vacuum. Okay, they don't have meaning in a vacuum. When I was in high school, we had to read George Orwell's 1984. Now, interesting book, kind of oppression, something or other, totalitarian regime, something or other, but very, very different than when Orwell was writing, I believe, in the 30s, and what he saw happening in Europe. So if you were in the context and you were feeling all of that, the various symbols that he uses would just pop for you, and you would feel the weight on a whole different level. Was I wrong about what year? No, okay. So it's that kind of thing. So kind of knowing the original audience, still it's powerful for us, but knowing the original audience and that context makes a huge difference. Apocalyptic literature stresses God's sovereignty over history. Okay, so always that though evil is at work, God is sovereign and He has a plan. As René said, there is a throne in the universe and it is not empty. Common features of apocalyptic literature, and you'll find this in all forms of it, is first a tour of the unseen realm by an angel who provides interpretation. So this is like the tour guide, or I might call it a docent, when you go to a museum. Now that I get to come to Rome regularly for Revive Europe board meetings, poor me, I like to, each time I come, go to a different site, a different museum. And I found that my experience is quite different when I have a tour guide who's speaking my own language, so it's the lady with the tall pole and some kind of a flag on top so we know which one is our tour guide and follow along. But having that person who's explaining, showing and explaining to us. So this is one of the main ways that Revelation is it's a revealing or an uncovering. It's happening through the interpretation of the angel, or in Revelation's case, angels. There's fantastical beasts. We see that's very strongly in Daniel, but also in Ezekiel. The beasts are both divine or heavenly. You've got, kind of strange beasts, but they're part of God's realm. And then there's also the evil expressions of violence, of control, that kind of thing. And finally, just the theme of divine intervention, universal judgment, and that there is salvation and eschatological future. Revelation is a total immersion drama meant to be experienced rather than analyzed. Okay, they didn't have projectors at that time. They didn't have multisensory kinds of things. So he's having to do it all with words, but it's meant to ignite your imagination, imagining a visual, and it goes around and around like being in a kaleidoscope. There's a tour right now, an art tour called the Van Gogh Immersion Experience. Have any of you had the opportunity to see it? It came to my city, and in a big warehouse, they projected on every wall. I mean, the whole wall, is projected in the columns in between, and there's slight narration going on, but Van Gogh's paintings are coming up and around you, and they're going through his life and whatnot. It's so incredibly powerful to experience all of those images together in a coherent experience, as opposed to going into a museum and just looking at one. And so I think part of where we get ourselves in trouble is when we don't read Revelation as a whole, and we read it as parts, we read it as chapters.
Some more context. So we've seen some in the sermons, right? So, but remembering that this is the Roman province of Asia. It was a very prosperous part of the empire. Well, when we visited, we were surprised by seeing even today, like industry or even well-developed cities. It's part of what Paul evangelized during his second and third missionary journeys. Remember, the first, he went to Galatia, right? Cyprus and then Galatia. And then the second one, Ephesus was the main place where he stayed. And then he left Timothy. He went back in the third missionary journey, then went to the Macedonia and Greece and all that. So it was a very significant time for the gospel's advancement in the Roman Empire. It was a key part of his mission. And we know that it was this huge door for the gospel, but also that Paul got a lot of opposition. And remember here, so here's the theater, and from the top of the theater, looking at the big main road that would lead to the sea. The sea would arrive at that point at the time. So just reading here from the passage. So when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is the Artemis of the Ephesians," the goddess, right? Soon the whole city was in uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. So it was such a big impact that the gospel was having there. There was this city commotion about it, right? It was very strong reaction. And Luke tells in Acts that the gospel spread throughout the province of Asia. And then what we find then is that among those churches, here John chooses 7 in Revelation, but among those 7, there were churches in other cities as well. For example, Colossae, from which have the letters to the Colossians, and Hierapolis. Remember the city where the hot warm water comes from? There was a church there as well. For instance, when Paul writes to the Colossians, he says, after this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. So he also wrote a letter to Laodicea, Paul, and we don't have that in our New Testament. It has been lost to history. And there was a church also in Hierapolis. So it was kind of from this main gospel point in Ephesus, different people, different disciples planted churches in the surrounding areas. And Paul then, when he writes 2 Corinthians from Ephesus, he talks about his own suffering that he suffered there. So let me read. "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death." So it was hard even for him at a season in which there wasn't major imperial persecution at the time, that even Paul despaired of life itself, right? Even the reactions they had on the city and in the region. And so the book of Revelation comes from that, as Lindsay mentioned, that kind of a point of suffering, right? A point in which the people of God are saying, like, "How long, Lord? Why aren't you doing anything?" I'm thinking today, like the situation of the church in Ukraine, right? Which is suffering a lot. And we've heard reports of Russians targeting Christians and evangelical Christians in a specific way. So it's a lot of massive suffering. And out of that comes this very specific kind of literature, which uses symbolisms, uses images, uses a lot of Old Testament allusions, which we're going to take a look now, so we can bring some kind of hope and perspective to those Christians suffering.
The book is a compilation. You can think about compilation albums of your favorite artists. It's a compilation of John's visions, of the Hebrew scripture, and of hymns of the early church. And you can imagine how powerful weaving those things together would be for the audience at these churches. But it's very important that we understand the Old Testament provides the interpretive key. I think you really can't understand Revelation without having that foundation in the Hebrew scripture. In particular, John drew heavily from Daniel and other apocalyptic books for imagery. And as René mentioned earlier, there's more than 400 Old Testament allusions. So I clump them into 3 different groups. The first is allusions about the divine, and the images for the divine actually are easier for us to access because of our own experience. But even the pictures of the sea of glass, that's an image from the temple itself. The molten basin before the altar. Thunder and lightning means a theophany, like at Sinai. Of course, lots with the Passover lamb and the role of the Spirit. I think the place where really studying the Old Testament allusions helps us most is in the descriptions of evil. And there are a lot of them. John helps us in Revelation 12:9. He's talking about this dragon, and he says, "Who is that ancient serpent?" All right, thank you. Who is this? So he's tying us back right to Genesis 3:1 through 1 through 15, and it says in John 12 that he's filled with wrath, and he's going out to deceive the nations. All right, so the serpent, in particular, in that role, a deceiver. He's also called Satan, which we know means the accuser. A very important image for evil in Revelation is the primordial sea monster, and you might miss that because he's called the dragon. And it's very easy for us in a Western context, when we hear dragon, we think of wings, breathing fire, snatch the maiden and sit on a bunch of gold, all of that kind of thing. But that's not the kind of dragon that he's talking about. If you were in a Chinese culture, you would think dragon, that's a happy image. That's a positive image, one of beneficence. It's not the Chinese dragon either. It's this. So it's this multi-headed sea monster. And all of the ancient cultures around the Mediterranean had this. They had different names for them, but they all have it. So, showing up here on different kinds of pottery and whatnot from very, very long ago. So in the Old Testament, names for this primordial dragon are Leviathan, Rahab. And Leviathan or Rahab, the goal always is to return the world to a state of chaos. So I like to call it the chaos monster. Like, how do we know that evil is at work? When we're seeing chaos, being stirred up. And certainly that's true in Revelation. Other things, we've already mentioned the beast, which just is very clear from Daniel that it means an empire that's gone beyond its legitimate mandate. Okay, so government that's gone beyond its legitimate mandate from God and has become greedy, violent, beastly. I think one of the challenges when you're reading Revelation is all these strange things about like this thing and it had this many heads and wings and horns and beasts. Often those are references to individual rulers. So you could have a beast with 10 horns, and that would be an empire and 10 different kings. Finally, a very important image of evil in Revelation is Babylon, okay? And so it takes us all the way back to the beginning. So the whole narrative arc of the scripture has Babylon in it. So you have the Tower of Babel at the beginning, kind of an image of the first empire that was trying to dominate and control, to be great, reach the heaven on its own. You have the city and the empire of Babylon, which is the one that destroyed Jerusalem, took down the temple, caused people to go into exile and whatnot. So when the early church would hear this with their Old Testament background, their Hebrew Bible background, they would understand we're talking about the enemies of God, right? The enemies of God that are against God's covenant people. So you might have noticed that this morning René said briefly about the kind of the evil trinity, or like a parody of the Trinity. How Revelation is written from chapter 12 forward is it introduces us to the dragon. Then it introduces us to the beast. Then it introduces us to the false prophet. Okay, that's the evil trinity. And then it introduces us to Babylon, the manifestation through government and cultural control on the earth. And so Babylon is it's the opposite of the New Jerusalem, the people of God. And then in the judgment, it happens in the opposite order. So it starts with the judgment of Babylon in 17, then the beast, the false prophet, and then finally the destruction of the serpent, the dragon, that final. There's many other Old Testament allusions. We talked about quite a few of them this morning, things around the Garden of Eden, Tree of Life, Holy of Holies, River of Living Water. Wherever as you're reading Revelation, you feel like there's some kind of an echo here, do the work to find out where it is. And not just in a proof text kind of way, but like, what does that image mean in its Old Testament context? And then how's it being used now in Revelation?
So it's good to review this moment, what was happening at the time, right? I think it's helpful to understand what was happening at that moment in that generation in those churches. Otherwise, every generation is tempted to find its own reference points in its own moment of time. Like we might think it's about how do you call it, code bars, like for products. It was in the 80s, 90s. Now in vaccine, people said it's 666 in the vaccine, or internet, or a number of things where people are anxious about, and we try to use our present reference point to understand Revelation. So it's very important to go back there and understand what was happening, right? So things we see in the book, like emperors holding iron scepters, emperors holding scrolls. And this, I took those images. In Rome, you see the road which leads to the Colosseum, to the altar to the nation, that big wide monument I showed yesterday. You see those statues there, which are the statues of the emperors in front of their markets they used to build. So it's right there. And also being able, I think, here's a quote which doesn't have anything to do with Revelation, but it shows the contrast of perspectives. So this one, the monument to the left, is called Arapachis. It's an altar to the peace, which at the time of Augustus, and it was kind of to celebrate how Rome brought peace to the world, the Pax Romana. So how good they are, everybody's at peace, the gods support this. It's a big monument to Rome. That's the victor's point of view, right? But the other point of view are the conquered people. So let's read. Let me reread this quote from a chief in Britain after Britain was conquered. So, robbers of the world, now that the earth fails their all-devastating hands, they probe even the sea. If their enemy have wealth, they have greed. If their enemy be poor, they are ambitious. To plunder, butcher, steal, these things they misname empire. They make it a desolation and call it peace. Which I think, so it doesn't have anything to do with Revelation, but it's another point of view from an oppressed people at the time. Which in a sense then, Rome would bring us that kind of image to the left, and all start celebrating their peace. But the people who are subjugated say, no, that's desolation, that's not peace. It's destruction, it's not a good empire. So Revelation is kind of helping Christians have that kind of point of view and articulate that from their own point of view of suffering, or also from God's point of view, looking at it from above. So some of the things we've seen, right, which are this coin from Caesar Augustus, and deified Julius Caesar. So after Augustus came to power, he considered himself a son of a god and had Julius Caesar be deified. Or Nero, playing the lyre as the god Apollo. So identifying ourselves power with religion. So the Roman emperors with the gods, with several of the gods. Here, Nero bring salvation to the world. And here we see kind of one of those bowls, which Revelation shows that as God like a breath. Yes. And here, so Revelation uses the kind of image, which was a kind of a religious symbol, was used in imperial worship. And here, Nero has this kind of a bowl of incense and to bring salvation to people, right? Then Vespasian. So a little bit more of history. So there was the Flavian the previous dynasty, from Julius Caesar, Augustus, all the way to Nero. Nero got mad, it was terrible, died. There was a kind of a civil war. It was about 4 emperors in a year and a half vying for power. The one who eventually consolidated power was Vespasian, the general who conquered Judea, who killed the Jewish revolt, right? So there was Vespasian, this guy here. And so that started a new dynasty. He's Vespasian, then his son Titus, then his son Domitian. So at the end of the first century, so they captured around 100,000 Jewish slaves, sent them to work mines in Egypt, to be killed in different arenas, to build the Colosseum, and in their triumph, their procession, we see, like for example, like now Putin, like doing these big military processions of their tanks, their missiles, even now conquer missions, tanks from NATO, right? He wants to display that in his military parades, right? So it was the Romans' military parade showing the captives from Judea and having them build things like the Colosseum, and then the Arch of Titus, in which shows like lampstands, like we see in Revelation, trumpets being brought as spoils of war to Rome. Imagine how disruptive that is, how offensive, right? Not only you're conquered, you're destroyed, people you know, relatives are enslaved, and they build monuments and show, we're for peace, we're saving the world. Like it's very disorienting, right? And here, Domitian with the 7 stars holding the suns, the planets at the time. At the time that they didn't have telescopes, but beyond Saturn, they couldn't see it like with the naked eye, right? So, and here they made this symbolism of a cosmic empire ruling over everything. And as I mentioned, so in the province of Asia, they were even taking the initiative, like when people want to suck up to the powerful and say we're for you and etc. So they were building those temples to venerate Rome, the emperors, and here depicts the first emperor built in the province of Asia to venerate Augustus, and then there were several others in Pergamon and in Ephesus and etc. So so a lot of it. So it was this very disturbing mix. It's hard for us moderns to think of that, but of political power and religious power coming together, one to legitimize the other, doing for oppression, for idolatrous purpose, for suffering, and having that kind of view of Rome and of the world being spread out as propaganda, even in their own coins, in their temples, and what they were leaving.
Well, any kind of overwhelming oppressive power needs some form of justification. And the way that the Roman Empire justified its economic and political control of the world all around the Mediterranean, and indeed was, extracting all of the value and natural resources and whatnot from all around the world in order to build its own capital. It justified this on spiritual grounds, okay? So it claimed, as we've seen, that the emperors were chosen by the gods, and therefore there was this imperial theology that built over time. And the imperial theology was promoted through a vast array of temples, of images, and of rituals. We've talked about, the first temples to emperor worship being built. First one actually was in Pergamum in 29 BC, and so it makes sense in Revelation 3:13 when John is writing to the church at Pergamum. He says, "I know where you live, where Satan has his throne." Okay, so Satan has his throne. That's a reference to here's what's true about that imperial temple. Now, emperor worship became particularly dominant or prominent during the reign of the worst emperors. So it kind of grew in significance under the reign of Caligula. That was 37 through 41. Under Nero, okay? So, of course, Nero is who killed so many Christians, including Paul and Peter. And then Domitian, who was emperor at the time of the writing by John of Patmos. There's something about particularly evil or controlling rulers needing to justify themselves all the more by kind of underlining, their divine connection. So there was this incredible network of structures. So think, temples, arches, reliefs carving on buildings and whatnot, but then also institutions that were created to express allegiance to the divine emperor. There were priests, professional paid choirs, monthly and annual celebrations, banquets given in the honor, citywide festivals for the emperor's birthday, crowns, incense, lamps, shallow bowls for pouring libations, all these kinds of things. Most of those were borrowed from pagan ritual. Okay, so in the things that had been being used to worship the pagan gods, and of course Rome was still supporting and encouraging the worship of various pagan gods, they just added imperial worship to that kind of pantheon and used very similar types of things. Caligula was interesting. He had the heads of statues of gods, so there would be, statues all around Rome, as there are today. He'd have the heads cut off and then put new heads of himself on top of those statues. There was a vassal king from Armenia who was deciding to change his allegiance from the Parthian Empire to the Roman Empire. When he came to Rome, he pledged his allegiance to Nero by saying, "I have come to you, my God, worshiping you as I do the sun god Mithra," that was the Armenian local deity. "The destiny you spin for me shall be mine, for you are my fortune and fate." Nero loved to present himself in particular as Apollo, the son of Zeus. So whenever you hear in Revelation, Jesus, the Son of God, it's a political statement as well as a religious one. The emperors are not God. Nero in particular, he erected an enormous statue of himself as Apollo. I think this is what it might have looked like. It was 30 to 35 meters tall, made out of bronze. The colossi, just like dominance over the city outside of the Colosseum. Now, Rome didn't require exclusive allegiance, so you could worship your own gods, that's fine, but you need to also venerate the emperor, and you must show this, due respect. Now, of course, it became an incredible problem for monotheists, so for Jews. The Jews had worked out with the government a religious exemption. And so when Jews started becoming upset with Jewish Christians, kicking them out of the synagogue, it became very dangerous for them because they no longer had that religious exemption. And now they were expected to participate in the cult of emperor worship and whatnot. And often it was the Jews in Asia Minor that were instigating the persecution, turning Christians over to the authorities. One author said, the imperial cult functioned like a contract with the population of Asia Minor. You give Caesar his due, and the gods will grant you peace, security, and prosperity. And failure to conform was considered unpatriotic and disloyal. So the Christians were being viewed as you're unpatriotic. Now, cherished convictions are expressed in symbols. Because that's true, symbols are very prominent in worship and in politics to this day. And they're used to form political and spiritual identity. We had the example related to national flags, cartoon images, the Russian bear, the Chinese dragon, etc., the Statue of Liberty. Symbols and symbolic acts form political and spiritual identity. Okay, so not just the symbols around them, but the symbolic acts, the participation in these rituals, they're used to form identity and underline allegiance. So, therefore, in the Roman world, these symbols and symbolic acts, they functioned like relentless propaganda. You couldn't get away from it. It's on your coins. It's on the processions going through. It's at when you get together with your guild to talk about business, it's there. They're just around you all the time. And I wonder if it's kind of like today when you go into a mall is just incessant propaganda around you. You need all of this in order to be good, have a good life. You need this beauty product. You need these clothes. There's advertisement. There's, displays, etc. And there's this, music that's being pumped in. Through all of that kind of immersive experience through the propaganda, you forget or can forget that quality of life has everything to do with the quality of your relationships. In a mall, it communicates there's nothing beyond this. There's no spiritual realm. There's nothing that's important related to learning or of truth. It's shaping a worldview. Now, we've seen, various of these things that communicated emperor worship, Domitian being addressed as Lord, our Lord and God. So, it's very important in Revelation. We see that. John is countering that propaganda. Jesus is the true Lord and God. Same thing, worshipers dressed and carrying laurel branches, citizens shouting, worthy when the emperor entered. I found it interesting that they had professional choirs, so people that are on the government dole, that so that they can be doing these, music and festivals kind of all the time. So, in one sense, the song that's going around in the province of Asia is the song of Caesar. Finally, there were many pledges of allegiance and ways that happened. In Revelation, pledges of allegiance are symbolized by marks. So mark on the forehead, mark on the hand, etc. When you see something about a mark, that's talking about allegiance. Who is your allegiance to? Now, as all of this was reinforced by this governmental system, religious system supporting the government. How John exposes it is that all of this religious system is actually dragon-empowered. Okay, so dragon-empowered political systems, dragon-empowered religious systems. Revelation 13 is very important in this. When I saw a second beast coming up out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. This particular beast is later called the false prophet. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. So within that religious power was the power for the persecution as well.
Yeah, so I find it interesting that here, just in this passage, so it seems like it's a lamb. It portrays itself like as a righteous worship, but it also speaks like a dragon, right? And he uses those images to help with people like acquire eyes to see the destructiveness of that kind of imperial worship. So, as Lindsay mentioned, so there was local tension between Jews and Christians that influenced Roman treatment. So they're being denounced by their Jewish family members, relatives, former friends. These people are no longer real Jews. They don't have their exemption. They have to sacrifice to the emperor. We see martyred Christians crying out then in Revelation chapter 6. So there's representing them being martyred, being killed. There was, and then there was at different points of the Roman Empire some local persecution, some local things, but then a more imperial things more in a more strong and systematic way during Nero, during Domitian, and then in later periods there were Emperor Valerian in the 2nd, 3rd century. And then the worst persecution of all was the one that happened about 10 years before Constantine came to power. So there was a tetrarchy. At the time, there were 4 emperors because the Roman Empire had been too big. And so they did 4 emperors kind of ruling over everything together, putting down revolts and things. They were generals mostly, not based in Rome anymore. So Diocletian was the main one. Then there was Constantine's father, who was generally didn't persecute Christians, and Constantine's mother was a Christian. And then the other 2, Galerius and Maxentius, they were terrible. Like kind of, if you want to sleep the night, don't read what they were doing at that time. It was terrible. And so that's also a reason why Christians were so, when Constantine came to power and became a Christian, people were like, whoa, like really, like imagine. Now we see how all the negative things that came out of it, of course. But at the time, it was such a major liberation, such a major end to suffering they were experiencing for about 10 years. We can see how he was really appreciated at the time. And here we have these images. So image of a statue representing a martyr in the catacombs in Rome. And see how they are symbolizing the Trinity, like laying down with their hands, like the symbol they're doing with their hands. And whenever I go to the Colosseum, I love just seeing that cross over there. The final sacrifice that stopped all the other sacrifices when the society recognized Jesus' sacrifice for us, right? So that is so meaningful, and I think it shows like the collective victory of Christianity. I think it's so amazing that the Roman Empire has been defeated, has crumbled centuries ago, but Christianity is alive and flourishing, and we are here because of Jesus, right? I think it's such a tremendous accomplishment, but without political power, without fighting wars, but actually suffering for God. I think it lays out a lot of the model for us, how we even can go about it today.
There are images, or there's description throughout Revelation about the persecution of God's people. Many, many references to it. And I hope this helps you to kind of unpack some of what that would be. There's one where they're under the throne and they're just crying out, "How long, O Lord? How long?" You know, the longing for God to stop this persecution. and John himself, experiencing that persecution, and his pastoral work in writing to these 7 churches to strengthen them to be able to be faithful and endure the persecution. Finally, we wanted to highlight for you the theme of God's supremacy in Revelation. So you'll see throughout that there's many places, particularly when we have the throne room scenes. I mean, I mentioned, we've talked about, 4 and 5. There's also in chapter 7 and 14, 21 and whatnot. But I think the reason why Revelation keeps coming back around to the throne room scenes is because of that counter to the propaganda to expose what's true. And in Revelation 4, we have this, images of beauty, majesty, radiance, holiness, the throne as a symbol of sovereignty. There's, the beasts and the people and the images, the angels and whatnot, representatives of God's people, all of creation, and the angels in perpetual worship. In chapter 5, of course, the Lamb who was slain is worthy to open the scroll. So it's, communication here about Jesus' sovereignty over history. And it says the worshipers sang a new song in chapter 5. A new song in the ancient world meant a song of victory or deliverance. Okay, so, they're proclaiming the victory and deliverance of Jesus, even in the midst of that's what's really true and happening, even while the Christians are wrestling to continue to proclaim Jesus. Jesus is victorious. John's helping them in that. One element of imperial worship was this processions. They love to have big processions and parades. Well, in chapter 7 and into 8, there is a procession. It's the procession of the great multitude that is brought from every nation, tribe, and tongue, and they're dressed in white, just like spectators at Nero's ceremonies would be. You would have Nero coming through the city in Rome, and everybody is decked out in white, not just the choir. They're waving branches. They're crying, salvation belongs to our God. What I particularly like is how John uses his depictions of Jesus. And some of them we kind of immediately get, and some we don't. Jesus as the ruler of the kings of the earth, as it says in Revelation 1:5. Whenever it says King of kings and Lord of lords, we're talking about emperor, right? So we could rightly say Jesus is emperor overall, because of course the emperors claim to be, they were indeed the king over all of the kings of these vassal states. Holding an iron scepter, Lord of history, holding the scroll. We've seen that. But there's this really interesting one in chapter 12. So if you haven't looked at Revelation 12 lately, I'd encourage you to do so. It's actually my favorite chapter in the book. In Greco-Roman culture, they had this myth of the woman Leto giving birth to Apollo and his sister. So again, Apollo, son of Zeus, while being opposed by the dragon Python. Okay, so this was like a well-known myth. And John takes that myth and he recasts it with Jesus as the baby that's being given birth, and it's through Israel, the people of God, that this the baby is born, and the dragon is right there trying to attack the baby, kill the baby. Well, in the myth of Apollo and the dragon Python, Apollo kills the dragon. All right, there's all of this art depicting Apollo with a bow and arrow or a sword chopping off the head of Python. And so here to use like a pagan myth and say, no, actually it's Jesus who was born to bring, take down the power of the dragon. And so then when you get in Revelation 20, when Jesus comes, to take the dragon and throw him into the lake of fire, it is that fulfillment of this Greek myth. That indeed the son who was born is the one who will conquer evil. There's another myth that he uses, which is so interesting, and that is there was this idea in Asia Minor, among some, that Nero would return. So Nero committed suicide. But there was this myth going around that he's going to come back from the dead, and he's going to come from the east leading Parthian armies. Now, the Parthians are the only empire that the Romans feared, what we would think of modern-day Iran. And the Parthians waged war with cavalry, so soldiers riding horses. That was not a Roman thing. Roman had foot soldiers and they had charioteers, right? But not cavalry. And so in Revelation 19, when we see, the rider on a white horse coming back and he's got the sword of truth coming out of his mouth, what he's leading is these armies. So it's not Nero who's going to come back and set things right. It's Jesus who's going to come and set things right. And then finally, as we've mentioned briefly, the picture of Jesus as a warrior with his robe dipped in blood, that was common for professional warriors to wear red uniforms as a way of saying, we've killed so many people, our clothes are dripped in blood. But instead, Jesus is covered in blood at the beginning, not at the end of the battle, because it's his own blood. There's other images of God's supremacy and his victory over evil. I think the description of the destruction of Babylon, particularly in chapter 17 and 18, is a very powerful picture of the complete destruction there. Of course, we have the defeat of the evil trinity where there's not even any battle. They're just captured, bound, thrown into the lake of fire. So it's like Jesus comes back and it's not even a struggle. He just comes back in his authority, and it is done. Evil is taken care of. And finally, pictures of God's supremacy. We can't underestimate Revelation 21 through 22. And of course, that the end of Revelation is the answer to Genesis 3, taking us back to Genesis 1 and 2, back to the garden where God dwells with humanity. René had mentioned it this morning, that the cube nature of Jerusalem, like practically that seems kind of difficult, how do you have a cube? But because it's communicating the Holy of Holies, the very presence of God with humanity again, and then that it's very specific with dimensions, how long it was. And so the holy city is large enough to encompass everything from Jerusalem to Rome, and its footprint is equal in size to the entire landmass of the Roman Empire. So the message is the Roman Empire is coming down. God will destroy it. And what he brings back will be a true kingdom of peace with the presence of God, and it will encompass all humanity because Jesus is indeed the true ruler of the kings of the earth. So I think the question that Revelation is really asking us is, will we bow towards Babylon or will we bow towards New Jerusalem? Which one do we think is our home? And do we have eyes to see what are the manifestations of Babylon in our own present day? And what are the manifestations of the New Jerusalem? We would say the kingdom of God. Do we have eyes to see that? And which one are we living in? So as you read the book of Revelation, we encourage you to always ask yourself, where is there a symbol? And does it have precedent? Does it have precedent in the Old Testament? Does it have precedent in contemporary Jewish or pagan culture? Does it have precedent in the Roman Empire or in imperial worship? When we do that, the book of Revelation comes to life in such great power. And if we don't, we'll assign meetings to John's symbols and miss his true message.